We'll go ahead and get started. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people, who have cared for this and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. So, good morning, everyone. I'd like to call to order the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force Steering Committee for Thursday, October 7th, 2021. It is 11:02 a.m. and we are meeting virtually. The first item for our consideration today is items for our next full task force agenda. So, Jill, what do we have so far?
So far, not much.
Not much.
Probably the rules of procedure, depending on what you guys decide to do with that today. Other than that, I don't have anything else.
Okay, so the floor is open for agenda items for the next full task force meeting.
I think,
Really?
yeah, there was discussion. We voted at the last task force meeting on the ARPA funds and the presentation that was done by Heather. And I was thinking maybe we could discuss what the next steps are on that, along with re-entry and how we want to use those. They also talked about a navigator, and I don't know how much the navigator is going to be working on just individuals that have behavioral health issues, but I think some people end up with behavioral health issues and drug issues because of the incarceration. And so having a navigator to make sure that those people that are leaving the jail are not now homeless, maybe due to orders or other things that stem from their arrest, would be beneficial. So I think we need to address, if we're going to look at using ARPA funding for a navigator, how that's going to be done.
Okay, so ARPA funds, especially with respect to the navigator issue. Caleb, your hand was up for a second.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to, and I think this will come up later in it as well, but I want to try and continue to press the point about data and in available data that we have here in Markham County and how it relates to our ability to really discover what is it that we're doing with the task force, how effective it is, whether we're really preventing full incarceration and to what level. And like I said, I know that that's going to come up later potentially, but I wanted to put that out there as a task force item potentially.
Okay. Dan?
So I'm on that team that is looking at recommendations for legislative fixes to the raft of new laws that came out. We meet tomorrow. I don't know if we're going to have recommendations ready to go, but if it's not the next full task force meeting, it would be the one after that. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Mike Parker.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I was doing some reflecting on Stephen's email to us after Dr. Harris's presentation, and I apologize not being able to join that task force. It was a day that I was not in the office, but I did watch it on YouTube. I watched the entire thing. I found it extremely compelling, and just riffing off what Caleb said about kind of an availability. Caleb, it almost sounded like you were talking about like a dashboard of what is available, right? It's kind of starting from that and knowing what's available. But Stephen, I appreciated an urgency that I picked up in your email, which is striking while the iron's hot, and there was an offer of assistance. And I think that could be really valuable to do that, because it just struck me, Stephen, your comment about that it is quantitative, but it's also qualitative, and having that and concurrent, meaning you're getting maybe fields of data, you're getting spreadsheets of data, but having that person that can help parse that out, knows the questions to ask. I just think she could help us map maybe a plan of attack. And I would just like to advocate that we do that sooner rather than later. And I would just also advocate that it's going to really help us with our goal, right, of figuring out how well we're doing for different groups and different ethnic groups and different race groups. It'll complement well, I believe, the county council's decision to join GARE. And I think it's key timing. So I would just like to urge us to elevate that. And if we have time to discuss it today about what charge we might want to take to Dr. Harris, and who we might identify to do that initial meeting. But that I think would be really important.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. I think that the presentation that we got last task force meeting was really powerful and insightful. And I really came away feeling well informed, but wanting more. So, and when she offered, like you said, offering help, I think we do need to strike while the iron is hot. Raylene?
I concur with all of that. I also have some concerns. I think I share that with Caleb on, even after listening to Dr. Harris, she's fabulous. And I think she's very capable of assisting us in some of our needs. But she also did mention in her presentation that she didn't do some of the stuff because not every system talks to each other. And, just the small cities alone, you're not seeing all the criminal charges that aren't being booked. And I think that's something that if we're going to address on how well we're doing in the future, we need to be able to see how many people are actually being charged and aren't going to jail versus who is going to jail. There's been a lot of changes with COVID and construction and everything else in there, but we need to be able to, if we're going to address this and ask for help, we need to make sure that we're able to include that as well.
Yeah, okay, good points. Other thoughts on that topic or others for the full task force?
At some point, oh, sorry.
Stephen?
Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to sort out, we have an agenda item that would address some of what we're talking about, how to focus and how to strike with Dr. Harris's help. Is that what we're proposing for the task force agenda, or is I'm getting the two threads I think are going through this a little tangled in my mind. I agree with Mike agreeing with me. And I do think that's an important discussion. I thought that's what we had a little bit further down the agenda, and the kinds of points that Caleb and Raylene were just making. I don't know if those are next task force agenda items or more within our purview to flesh out more as well.
Yeah, no, good point, Stephen. I think, we need a framework of what that might look like, I suppose, and have that hashed out here. Dan?
Probably not for the next meeting, but I want to just make sure that we are considering this. The alternate response team, for certain types of behavioral health calls, is being sorted out. I don't want to characterize where it's at necessarily, but it will be theoretically online early 2022. I do want to make sure that that's on our radar for a future meeting. Just from the behavioral health committee's perspective, I view that as a high priority. So I want to make sure that that's on for probably December.
Okay, Caleb?
Thank you. So my point about the data integration and the available data is, I think that at the next task force meeting, I would like to keep the conversation going. We don't necessarily have to have answers at that level. Obviously I want to talk more today about this issue, but for a specific agenda item for the task force, I think that needs to be, hey, we had this discussion, this is the result, or where we're headed, our trajectory. I just want to keep the buzz going. I don't want it to die off. That was my only point in mentioning it for the task force.
Okay. Other thoughts about the next task force meeting? Jack, you have any?
Not that's not in the agenda. I mean, we have the rules of order, some discussion about crisis stabilization. No, I don't have anything that isn't, I think, going to be addressed later in this meeting.
Okay.
But I concur with Stephen. So Stephen, just like you agree with Mike, I agree with you. And I fully support the perspective you're taking on this.
Arlene? You're muted.
I'm really anxious to hear about the details of the alternate response team. I haven't heard or seen anything about it. And so I'm really, really curious to hear about that. But I'll wait.
So thanks for asking that. Dan, do you know when at least a summary report might come to this group?
I don't know exactly. There were different ideas about where it could be housed, and I think that that's sort of I wouldn't call it a sticking point. There's a number of different things. There's where it's housed, behavioral health specialist, workforce issues, getting people to apply for those jobs, and then getting the rigs for the specialized rigs, which my understanding is that they have to be ADA accessible, be able to transport a person, have oxygen ready to go. So these are not like off the shelf. You can't go over to Iowa Drive and just get a pickup truck or whatever. It's not going to work that way. So there's those animating issues that are delaying this. And I talked with the mayor 2 days ago about this, and had some assurance that this would be ready to go by January of next year. And he's made that commitment. So that's what I know right now. I think it might be housed in fire, but I don't know that for sure. And it's probably going to be a Bellingham only response at this point until we can get things sorted out and figure out the call types that they can go to.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Jack?
I forgot I did have one other thing. Barry, I don't know if this is the current task force, but at what point did you want to introduce, or should we introduce some discussion about ongoing topic about possible support of new jail or new criminal justice thing? When are we introducing that?
Okay, so right now where that's at, just to give everybody that's on the call here that maybe don't know what Jack's talking about, we were discussing the restarting the criminal justice what's it called, public health, safety, and justice initiative. That process back up again, which included the needs assessment for our criminal justice needs here. And the first step that we thought we'd need to be taking is to reactivate the advisory committee that the council has appointed, because we appointed that about 18 months ago, maybe even longer. And we don't even know if some of those folks are interested in participating. So we have now sent out letters. I think that was done early this week to those folks to see, gauge that interest and get that data back and find out where that's at. But one of the things that we talked about I talked about with the executive and the prosecutor, and I've talked with Tyler Schroeder. We talked about kind of the missing leg of the stool when we decided we weren't going to go with HOK as kind of our best practices contractor. That contract has been now I don't know if void is the right word, but expired just due to time and COVID. So the thought is that we could do a lot of that needs assessment work locally with professionals, and we thought a good guiding, almost a steering and policy function could be achieved somehow through the task force because of our expertise and in our membership. And so I talked that over with Stephen and Jack, and just kind of high level, what might that look like? We didn't get too far on that because the process hadn't even been like restarted by the council. But then that happened last council meeting, so that's why we sent those letters out. So we want to start that discussion of how maybe it's this committee, maybe it's a new subcommittee, maybe it's the task force as a whole. Open to ideas, but we just think the expertise lies there in some of those policy and kind of keeping things on track functions. We are going to have the sessions facilitated, so that that's a separate issue as far as the large group. But just kind of to keep our finger on the pulse and make sure that things are evolving and going the right direction. So that's something that's going to be coming forward. We're doing kind of a slow roll out of this because of again, we don't know what the committee's going to look like once we get all these responses back. But anyway, that's what Jack's talking about is utilizing some of the expertise here to help that process. Stephen?
My hand was up because I wanted to go back to the agenda item on keeping data questions in the forefront. So if we're not wrapped up with the public health, safety, and justice initiative question, maybe we should wrap that up and then I can come back on.
Sure. Perry?
I'm jumping around a little bit here as well in terms of just touching base on the alternative response team meeting. We had actually a meeting with the mayor and executive and City of Bellingham staff with some recommendations this last Tuesday. And essentially the discussion was that there were a number of parallel recommendations coming in, as Mr. Hamill had shared, and that it was best possibly to consider reconvening the executive group that was working through the alternative response team sort of data, and development, and take a look at all of those recommendations, the proposals that were coming in, and be able to then return and having considered all of those, and whether or not that those would be something that maybe are more running parallel, or if there was some way to do some, combination of those and make that recommendation. So just wanted to add that piece that was sort of the recommendation that was brought to that group and was supported, essentially. And so wanted to provide that information.
Okay, thanks, Perry. Arlene?
Yes, I wanted to comment also on the alternate response team, the three issues that you brought up. Of the three, two of them are more or less technical, but the one that is really absolutely crucial is the staffing and the plan for how it's going to operate, because that's the heart of what you're doing on the street. The vehicles and the location are less significant than the effectiveness of the people who are going to lead and participate in it. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Raylene?
Thank you. I think at the next Legal and Justice Committee, we're going to be talking about where we want to go next with some of the domestic violence discussion we had, and probably trying to promote more behavioral health specialists for DV treatment as well as mental health treatment. I think that's also something that was being pushed for with the ARPA funding on trying to get more individuals in this area and what direction to go. I don't know if we will have completed that at the next legal and justice meeting, but it is a topic and it might be something that maybe want to be brought to the task force to see what the task force wants to do. Are we reaching out to Western? Are we trying to get scholarships for individuals in the behavioral health field? What direction they want to assist, or the task force wants to assist in trying to get some of those needs met.
Okay. Stephen?
Okay, I'll come back to the data discussion question of the next task force, and I think I'll direct this first to you, Caleb. But what I understood from your point and Raylene's agreement was it would be useful early on to talk about the snapshot that we could have of our data, what we have jurisdiction by jurisdiction, what we don't have. And then we have a whole list of questions you got from subcommittees on what we'd like to have. So my suspicion is that you may have some of that already from the meetings that you've had. Is it possible to sort of chart that out, and that could be the focus of a report and a further discussion? So Raylene identified the huge gap we have with not having data from municipal courts. And you've previously said some jurisdictions have not really been providing information. But I think we know what information they might have. So I'm just wondering, would that be a starting place for the next task force meeting?
I think that's a great question, Stephen. I believe that I could chart it out. I could chart out what we have so far, at least what we've been given. We started out initially very, very early stages of index with a spreadsheet essentially that lays out what data points we think exist and which sort of contributing agencies have at what level, what information they do have. In my head, I have a fairly decent understanding of what information exists and where it exists and in what capacity, not to a level of granularity that I think we really need, but I have a pretty good overview of what is available to those individual agencies. And I guess my bent or my trajectory, my goal in all of this is keeping my eyes on a goal, an endpoint of having a repository for information that then can be used to make decisions really at every level where there are decision makers that interact with this kind of data. And the reason why I keep talking about it in terms of a repository is I believe wholeheartedly that unless we gather the information from the individual municipalities, courts, law enforcement agencies, prosecutors' offices, if we don't gather all of that information together in a meaningful way, then we're going to be continuing to operate on less than whole information. And so the presentation Dr. Harris had was very hopeful. I can't remember who said that, but I came away feeling very hopeful that yes, this can be done in a similar fashion in another place, and perhaps she could be a very good resource for how that can be done for us, having already navigated a fairly complex justice system down in King County. But we have a lot of gaps, I would say, as you mentioned before, in our ability to get the information. It's not that the information doesn't exist. I know it exists. It's a question of whether it's either A, consumable, meaning that it's on paper format or in a format that isn't easily transferable to another database or repository, or B, historically speaking, we haven't had the best success getting information from some sources. I don't want to get too much into the specifics on that, but we definitely have not had the best success getting information from some sources. That landscape could be completely different today, because again, we started this conversation years ago. So it could be very much that the landscape is different now and people are willing to support this effort, and we won't have any barriers to that success. And I hope that's the case.
Are you saying there's been resistance?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't want to, I don't want to call anybody specifically out.
No, you don't have to. It's just a fact.
So just to follow up, I think if you could set out that kind of charting, it would do a couple of things. One, it would emphasize the single repository kind of concept you're suggesting, which I think Dr. Harris herself urged for us. But also, I think we'd see where we weren't getting data that we think exists. And we've got people with more authority sitting at the task force table than we did sitting around the index table. So I'm hoping that the transparency of saying we don't have data that we think you got might be a leverage point to pry some of that loose and start a little bit better flow of data. So I guess that's where I was thinking for the task force discussion.
Yeah, and I absolutely can get the information that we've had to date prepared, recognizing that, again, it is a couple of years old, at least, in terms of, the data points that were collected back then. But I would also say, and I would urge the county, Barry, if you can be listening to this, we, the index committee, have reached a point where we can't do everything that we hope to get done without additional help and resources in terms of somebody specifically who is familiar with statistical analyzation. Is that a word? Analysis, sorry.
So I think this is a great, is there anything more about agenda items for the next task force meetings? I think we should just move directly into the index committee discussion since we're already there. So, and I have some thoughts on what you just mentioned, Caleb. Anything else on agenda items, Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Just following up, and it may just be my memory and not remembering, but where we left off with our communications push, I just didn't hear mention at this one, and I might have missed it at a previous meeting, but I know we talked about getting a request for, I think qualified people was going to be a plan, and then this task force might be able to then select from a pre-approved person to start that work. Where is that worthy of bringing that process back up, and what is the status if somebody knows more than I do? I just don't want to leave that thread and have it die.
I can give you guys an update on that at the end of the meeting if we have some time.
One thing I can tell you, Mike, is that when we got to the end of where we had to get budget requests in for next year, I put in for just a placeholder for 50,000 for us. For that kind of work or data analysis work, just since we had no real, we hadn't really fleshed it out that much yet, but we just put some money, as a placeholder for next year so we could do that work.
Okay, great, thanks.
I keep forgetting this when I do have the floor, so I'm just going to barge in right now. I should have said this at the beginning. I wanted to sort of officially welcome Perry to this esteemed group. Huge shoes you're filling, obviously, but we're really lucky to have somebody of your knowledge and wisdom joining us and taking a leadership role in this group. So glad to have you on board, Perry.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll certainly do my best. You're right. It's been a couple of weeks, and the flow is rising. I've got some great support. I don't know if folks are aware, but it may be important here that Dean White had been working obviously with Grace and working within the county, and has some extraordinary knowledge. And so, in regard to supporting us, Erica, the health department had suggested maybe we'll utilize Dean as sort of a focal point for most of the behavioral health stuff and et cetera. So I think that was very wise. Also that Erica has hired on, for lack of a more appropriate term, headhunter group to really actively pursue the manager position for the human services. And so we should likely see some candidates from across the country, to be honest. So that's sort of what's happening there. And thanks. I hope that I can meet expectations. That's what I'm after at this point.
Glad to hear Dean's on board. You couldn't do better than him.
Yes, I agree, Stephen. Anything else on agenda items? Okay, let's just go straight into item number 6, which is the data index committee, and wrap that discussion up since we were already into it. We kind of talked a little bit about Dr. Harris's presentation. Is there anything more we want to talk about there? Yeah, Raylene?
I don't like to just point out the bad, but I think it's important that we keep an eye on some of the things that are going to be skewed in the data. And I keep seeing things that come across my desk and data that changes what our outcomes would be when we do get the data. So on a regular basis, I see the race and the ethnicity changing on citations that are being filed. Even locations for arrests, those change. And so trying to get some of that information is going to be difficult, because you're always going to see a rotation of staff in the courts and in law enforcement. And you can tell somebody to write a ticket a certain way, but it's only as good as the trainer. And you're going to have new trainers coming in all the time. And you're also going to have defendants that are being arrested that aren't going to want to cooperate with law enforcement. So as much as we want perfect data, I think it's important to realize that whatever we do get is going to be somewhat skewed. As I did a domestic violence data with AOC recently, and we have mental health evaluations as one of the sections, and that's in a field that you have to enter as a court staff if the mental health evaluation has been ordered. But if the court staff doesn't know that needs to be in there, then when we run that information and we run that data, it doesn't show that that mental health evaluation was ever done. And I know for a fact, being in the jail on 3 different courts, that there have been mental health evaluations on some of those individuals that came out of that were never entered into the system. And so I just don't want us to think that when we get all of this information that it's going to be perfect and that everything's going to be right, no matter how much help we get. I just want to make sure that we don't give everybody the hope that everything's perfect once we get Dr. Harris or anybody else assisting.
What do you actually mean by the information changes? I didn't quite understand that.
I filed a ticket the other day that the information in the judicial system had the ethnicity as Native American. And then the citation that came in had the ethnicity as unknown. And then it also had Caucasian down under race. And you have to file it with most current information on the citation due to person business rules that are issued through the state. So that citation was the last known contact with this individual on the street, but the information that was entered into JIS a year earlier might have had more accurate information. It just depends on who's having the contact with that individual and who's not, and it changes on a regular basis. And so when people are putting information in, somebody might have been stopped at the P-Search port of entry, and one officer writes 781, one officer writes P-Search port of entry, another officer writes the exact address of the customs. So every time somebody files that information, it's different. And so when you're trying to pull that data, you can't accurately pull the data because you have to be able to combine all that information. And that's something that Dr. Harris might be able to help us concentrate on certain things. But unless the information input is the same time, you're never going to have accurate data.
Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I certainly hear your concern and a phrase that was told to me a long time ago, be aware of letting perfect be the enemy of the good. And Raylene, you have an excellent point, and we are not going to have perfect. I don't think that's really the key thing. I think honestly, it showing that to some degree, maybe it's a mess, and I don't mean to use that word loosely, but I think we're going to have a little bit of a mess when we look at both data collection, recording, disparate systems, siloed. That's part of the exercise though. And I hope that we see value in looking at what our mess looks like and figuring out maybe a path forward and making incremental improvements. So certainly hear you loud and clear, we're not going to get perfect data, but seeing what we do have, I think will really help. Will also go to help. One of the main goals that I see this as this task force is really relating to the public at large and being able to increase our level of transparency. What I was going to specifically talk about though is Stevens offered for maybe a small group, and if the steering committee wants to authorize that, to have a discussion with Dr. Harris and take her up on that offer to see what might make sense. There's a buffet of options. It's very large, as we're hearing from Caleb. We know that the subject is vast, but maybe a kind of an unofficial conversation with Dr. Harris might help us zero in on a couple of likely areas. Maybe it's based on what she researched. We might choose an area to get moving on it and to see what that might look like and to see if she would help us strategize. And I guess my thinking would be, would that be smart to do in advance of a future meeting that might need action? So if there is going to be such a conversation, to suss that out a little bit further, we might want to get on that, get that scheduled so that we can keep moving. So that was just a thought that I had, and volunteer if you need folks to be there with Dr. Harris in any type of that conversation.
Well, let's just take a second and ponder that idea. What's everybody think of that? I think it's a good idea. I'd volunteer to be on that call or Zoom or whatever it ends up to be as well, Mike.
So I see Barry, Caleb, Mike. I would certainly be interested in participating in that. Raylene, would you want to, you have a sort of unique perspective here.
I'm interested in it. It just has to kind of somewhat coordinate with my other jobs.
Depending on your time availability, at the very least, I'd like it if you could feed some questions and input into that conversation.
I'd be happy to, thank you.
So Jill, is that something that you can coordinate and talk to Dr. Harris and find out some available times and dates?
I can do that. Are you talking about just having an informal Zoom meeting with her and the 4 or 5 of you?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I could try to frame what we're hoping to have that discussion focus on, Jill, if you want.
Whatever information you'd like to provide would be appreciated. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Caleb.
that was what my comment was going to be is I think I sent out my request to everybody, thinking along the lines of where we might want to start a bite-sized bit of cooperative work with her, like Mike said. And I was thinking along the lines of what do we need in GRACE and LEAD and ART to demonstrate both the human value and the cost savings of the work that goes on there. And, you know, that would be one example, which would both be public transparency and quantifying the value of the work of the task force. But there are other questions like Raylene just raised is how do we deal with the sort of the inherent chronological differences and inaccuracies? How do we deal with really messy data? My recollection is that mostly she said she went by AOC data, but I also think she said she actually went into the bowels of Seattle Municipal Court and worked with those folks to actually pull out the kind of messy data Raylene was doing. So that sort of methodological question might be another place to start with her. So I hope that could be part of our first discussion together.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Caleb.
Thank you. So a couple of things. Jill, if you can take a look at our previous submissions, I just kind of did a quick search in my email. The only one of the, it's called index data collection form. There was a form that we began filling out, and the only one that I have is the one that I filled out myself. There are other versions of this that came after, and I just don't have those readily available. So Jill, if you would take a look, and it doesn't have to be right now, but when you get a chance, would you just take a look and see if you can find one of those?
Are you talking about the data matrix, Caleb? Yeah,
Yes,
I know where that's at. I can send it to you.
Perfect. Thank you. And then secondly, I love the idea of talking to Dr. Harris. I think that's that could potentially be very valuable for us. In all of this discussion, the cautionary tale is if you don't have the right data or you don't have the right data displaying the right things, you can be skewed in any viewpoint. I mean, a good person at statistical analysis could make the data say almost anything they need to. And so it really boils down to what do we want to know? And to the degree that we are very specific about what questions we're asking, that will make it much easier to actually get correct data in return. So, you know, I think we all are thirsty for some answers, right? You know, how effective has this group been? We've been meeting for years. How effective have we been? That's not a specific question. And so, but it's something that I want to know, but it's not a specific question. So we have to get to a point where we can agree on 2 or 3 very specific and key questions, like Stephen was mentioning. You know, what 3 data points could we gather that would change the landscape of what Grace is able to, you know, see, and how effective can that be, kind of a thing. Like, be very specific about the outcome before we go in, because I believe wholeheartedly that Dr. Harris's study was about people who were convicted and their monetary penalties at the time of conviction. And then she took those 2 data points or those concepts, and then the whole study stemmed based on that. We have to get very specific about the questions that we're asking. Otherwise, we're going to get all kinds of different responses potentially.
So would one of the questions be, or is it specific enough to ask the question, the exact population of the jail when we started and the population now?
That is absolutely a question, but I can answer that in minutes.
Right.
Yeah, that's
So
not
that's not a hard question. The harder question is why?
Why? Okay. All right. Yeah.
So Caleb, I'm thinking about, you know, that what we've talked about kind of in and out of this whole discussion was that kind of the garbage in, garbage out scenario of messy data. Is there any training that goes on that attempts to standardize any kind of data entry across all aspects of the data that gets entered into the criminal justice system?
I would say almost unequivocally no. And the reason I would say that is we exist, as I think we've mentioned before, in silos. Every agency has their own purview. They have their own emphasis. Raylene and I talked earlier this week where if it isn't important to this particular agency, it may not even get it entered into AOC, or because it doesn't work in the format that they expect it to, it doesn't get entered into AOC. For the sheriff's office as a whole, we emphasize all of the data collection points that we have, but some of them are available and some of them are not. It depends on people's cooperation. If you're expecting them to give you voluntarily information, it depends on the type of interaction you're having. If you're having a simple traffic stop where you're writing a citation and letting somebody go, that's different than somebody who's being fully booked into a facility. So the collection points are different based on the interaction. And then again, it's different in terms of what repository that information is going into. For the sheriff's office, we use Spillman, and many of the other municipalities, they use Longarm. And there are necessarily differences even in just the way that we collect demographic information. It's coding differences. It's do they translate well? And so we might use 5 codes for race and they might use 7 or 12. And so where we're going to run into problems is integrating data in a meaningful way can be challenging, especially the farther we cast our net, which I think is important to recognize.
I guess
If I could just jump in here, Barry. What Caleb is describing and Raylene before is real life on the ground problems. One of the real values, I think, of engaging with Dr. Harris is we have a whole different perspective. She comes from a nationwide network of analysts. You know, our ordinance calls for us to follow best practices. We don't know on the ground whether there are pilot projects, you know, on the East Coast or other, whether there's a way that people who know the systems would recommend that we deal with the kind of on the ground problems Caleb and Raylene have been describing. So I think that would be one of the things we could pick her brain about is are there guideposts out there somewhere that we can look at to try to settle some of these differences here across jurisdictions that we're facing.
Raylene?
I would like to add county prosecutor and a small city prosecutor to the group, because I think we do need to see how many people are being charged and how many people are actually being followed through. I know with the COVID that Ferndale prosecutor was actually holding cases to decide who he wanted to bring into court and who he didn't based on a priority from before. And I'm sure that the county has cases that are sitting on the juvenile prosecutor's desk or as well as the felony prosecutor's desk, and they're waiting to determine, are these cases going to go? Or are they still sitting there? Are they going to be there for 3 years? What's the statute of limitations? And I know that's really broad, and we got to try to narrow some of these questions down and be very specific. But if we really want to see how many people are in the jail, how many people should be in the jail, and how many people are actually we're resolving outside, we need to bring in the prosecutors to see how many cases are actually sitting on the desk and how many cases are actually being filed and how many cases are just being done in court without being booked.
Other thoughts on this topic? I mentioned the data, the review of possibility of hiring a data analyst. I mentioned that what we have done is, like I said, just done a placeholder for some money for next year. Reviewing information from Ann and Jeremy. Has everybody got a chance to see that? I haven't really got a chance to review it. Do you have something to put up, Jill?
Yeah, I can put up the agenda. Give me a moment here to do that.
Barry, before we move on to this, when you said you'd put up a budget placeholder, I thought you had mentioned that for the communications person. Are those two separate?
No, it's just one because we didn't know kind of what direction things were going to go as far as like countywide communications and how there's a whole public participation group that's looking into how communications countywide works. So we would probably be looking at and there's some thoughts about the data analysis too, as far as what I talked about before about potentially having the task force involved in the needs assessment. We were thinking that hiring a person to do some of that data analysis would help kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, in that we could use that consultant for the work on the needs assessment as well as the index committee work. So that was kind of the preliminary thinking that money would come out of the jail fund, not budgeted separately like I did for the communications. So you're right, Stephen, it was for communications. Okay, what do we have here, Jill?
So the information, there are several pages here. First, we have a response from Wendy Jones, who came in. This email from Wendy came in later, it looks like. Do you want to look at Wendy's information first or the information that Jeremy sent?
I'm just looking through this real quick.
And all of this is in your packet, if any of you have your packet in front of you.
Yeah, I tried to print my packet out this morning. It didn't work. So I apologize for that. I don't know if it was my printer or me, but. Anybody need more time with this piece? Why don't you go ahead and put Jeremy and Ann's piece up?
So I don't know if you can see this real well. I can zoom in, but you're not going to get all of it on one page.
It was better the way you've had it first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right there.
That's good for me. It didn't print in any readable form. It was so small.
Just let me know where you'd like me to stop scrolling. Yeah, and this is the last of it here.
Okay. Some of these categories, I'm not quite sure what they are, but.
I'd be curious to see how much this information changes with some of the law changes that just happened. with Lead and with Grace, with the Blake decision, with the fact that we're not booking people due to COVID. There's a lot of factors that are involved that I don't think are gonna make this true to what really is happening.
Caleb?
Lowered my hand, forgot to unmute. Thank you for hearing me one more time. I know I've talked a lot, but one of the things that I think would be important, and perhaps this is a proposal, is maybe we have an informal session that sits down and talks or fleshes out or brainstorms exactly what it is that we want to ask. It doesn't have to be an exhaustive list, but it would be nice to know before we go to Dr. Harris that we have a couple of key questions that we would like to answer broad spectrum across our criminal justice system that we think will help us to go, like step one on our journey is we answer this question and this question, and then that will help us to endeavor to answer future questions, or they set the stage for future questions.
Okay, Dan?
So I'm a little confused on this booking utilization. I'm looking at booking utilization in my packet here, 6 months pre-post enrollment. Grace, it shows that the count post for booking was 1 person, and Lead it was 0 people. Is that true? Is that correct? Do we know?
That appears to be correct based on the information that's in Gelada. The question that I would have is what Raylene asked, is it because of Lead or Grace, or is it correlated, right? Causation, correlation, what's the cause? If there's a root cause analysis to be done, then that's what I would like to find out.
Yeah, because I mean, this looks really, really good, but if it's because of Blake and because of the new laws, because of COVID, then this doesn't really mean anything. There's no, like you're saying, Caleb, there's no, the causality is not, it's not tied to necessarily a person being enrolled in one of these programs. So that's got to get sorted out. Is there a way to do that?
I think that there is a way to do it. It's just a question of, again, if the question is how many people who are enrolled in Grace right now have been booked at all since their enrollment in Grace, this appears to be the answer. If the question is why, like Arlene and I talked, if the question is why, then that needs to be fleshed out a little bit differently. And it might mean that the part of the issue is that, we've got completely different booking restrictions than we did at the beginning of these people's enrollments in Grace. It might also be, like you said, that the Blake decision had massive impacts on who was arrested and for what reason. And there was a period of time where no arrests at all were taking place for any level on drug-related offenses. And so there was a whole bunch of timing months where some of that might have played a role. And so we just have to be careful about the questions we're asking, because this does look very hopeful, but I don't know that this means anything if it's not truly correlated in that sense, or I'm sorry, caused in that sense.
Mike?
You all bring up good points. I would say that the data, of course, has meaning, but it begs further questions. Is I guess what I think. It shows a marked reduction, and I think it would be on one side wrong to assume that it's all due to COVID. I think we could assume that there's good work happening here, but in order to ferret out the delta, what amount is the good work that's happening through the engagement with case management and connections and behavioral health supports, and what is from COVID booking restrictions is a really important asterisk. I just want to underline that the data is still meaningful. It just needs further, it needs further work. And I think that's one of the things that we find. And I think why the public can sometimes find this so distasteful in our conversation, even challenging, is because we'll haggle about it. But just want to state, one, it's still meaningful. Two, as Caleb said, we have to ask further questions to try and parse out why. And one potential thing that we could discuss with Dr. Harris is when you have this and you have confuscating variables, you have things going on, how can you separate those out as a researcher, right? What might be a way, could we look at booking pre and post COVID, try to come up with some amount of delta that's happening just because of COVID booking restrictions, and then apply that to this data? That's just a brainstorm. But I think those are the kind of things that Dr. Harris might be able to help us with, is something you take like this. And Dan and Caleb's question and observations are so clear. If we don't answer those and we try to say that it's because of the great work, well, we haven't exactly 100% proved that. So I would just say that it begs further question, and we could get some help, I think, in what are those questions, and maybe then take it the next step and actually fine tune that data, scrub that data, clean that data, and apply another analysis that could ferret out, is it because of COVID booking restrictions, or is it because of Blake decisions?
Dan?
Yes to everything that Mike just said. And the part two to that is, who does this? Who does the work? So someone's got to take it up. If it's everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility. So one person or group needs to, I guess it's index, needs to pick it up and go with it and figure out take out the COVID pieces of it and put, and measure the lead and grace piece. The other thing that's not in here is drug court. And I would want to have a little bit better understanding of impacts on drug court. And speaking with the prosecutor last week, it appeared to be the case where drug court has been impacted by not just COVID, but the Blake decision. And I don't know to what extent the new legislation that came out of Olympia. So I think to me, like, I want to have better understanding. We're making investments in these programs. Drug court's not just the court system; it's the recovery house that on DuPont that we built and paid for. It's Grace and Lead, and then new investments in ART, alternate response team. So if we're putting all this time, energy, resources, thinking into these programs, I want to make sure that it's well spent. So I just want to understand those things.
Anything else to wrap up our index discussion for today? Caleb, do you have any final thoughts?
If we can decide here, it would be useful for me knowing going forward if there will be a separate meeting where we're talking about specific questions, because I agree, we've got questions, we end up with more questions than answers more often than not. And I'm happy to try and answer some questions, but what we've tried to do in the past with index is answer this question with this much information and this much time. And I'd like to try and reverse that, where we're answering this question with this much information and this much time. So if we can determine that there needs to be further development of specific questions, that would be helpful for me. And then again, I'm willing to be a part of it, but I can't be everything.
Stephen?
I think Caleb's right that there would be value in having a pre-meeting discussion to try to focus what we wanted to talk to Dr. Harris about, at least at the outset. So I'd be in favor of that, and I think Jill could schedule that for us. I originally raised my hand to note and emphasize the fact that in the materials Jill included for us was an email response from Wendy Jones to some data inquiries. And to me, the crux and the most emphatic thing Wendy was telling us was we needed a full-time dedicated data analyst housed as a county employee. And we may not be able to write that job description yet, but we're also at a budget development point and an ARPA allocation point where it would be very valuable if we could not lose those waves going through and have to wait another year for that to happen. So I don't know how we deal with the urgency of that, but it seems like that would be a key piece to how we would move this forward.
Even really quick, I just want to reply to that too. I wonder if there's something even in the interim, even before a job description could be created and county council voting on dollars for that. You know, Dr. Harris was talking about some grants that we might be able to go to. So I'm thinking that we might still, not to say that's not valuable, because I got really excited as soon as I heard that. I couldn't imagine Caleb actually having help in this endeavor, and having all of us be able to access our data better on this level would be huge for the community. But I just want to remembering that something that she said, she might be able to help us consult with us about how to get a grant. And maybe like Caleb says, we're not answering the biggest question. We choose through a careful process a couple of key questions. Maybe we're looking at program efficacy, as Councilmember Hamel talked about. Maybe we're looking at, you know, people with traffic stops, LFOs, whatever we choose one or two issues, and then we see if Dr. Harris can help us get a strategy to fund the research and then to actually perform and help us scrub and clean the data. That's what I'd like to put forward, and not hinge it necessarily on a newly created position, but that's a great suggestion.
Great point on the grant possibilities, Mike.
Yeah, it is. Anything else? So it sounds like what I took away here is that we probably need a little pre-meeting. Jill, if you could set that up with the folks that are interested in talking to Dr. Harris, and I think we can maybe clarify the points we would like to talk to her about when we get her on the line. So anything else? Well, let's move back to rules of procedure. Jack sent out a good motion matrix, and you can kind of see the different kinds of motions are dealt with. So, Jack?
Well, I think this will be the third meeting we've talked about. I'm hoping the third time's the charm. Jill has done a masterful job of integrating everybody's comments. I hope that the matrix that we've identified that you see in your packet captures what people we're asking for. So there's clarification for the 2/3 and so forth. And I would be looking today for the steering committee to recommend, hopefully unanimously, that this go to the task force as a whole to address the issue we had a few months ago to clarify our decision-making processes. So I'm open for any questions or discussions. I know we've discussed it a lot, but there may be more questions now.
Okay, let's open it up. I think for me, everything is pretty clear, so I don't really have any questions myself.
Well, that's really pretty much Jill. I mean, I helped some, but we've got great support. I guess I would ask, does anybody have an objection for Stephen and I saying that the steering committee supports this and we're putting it to the task force as a whole? I guess that's where we're at. Okay, so seeing none, that's what we're going to move forward with. And Jill, thank you so much for pasting that in and making us look good. Appreciate
Jill,
it.
did you do that table? That thing's amazing. I've never seen it that clear ever. Oh, you didn't? You just dropped it in. Anyways, it's actually a good primer for me on how these things operate. So thank you.
Fine-tune it. And when I was the co-facilitator for NA World Services, now trust me, when you have 200 passionate addicts and risers, you have to have a lot of good. So that came from that, and our parliamentarian kind of came up with that some years ago. So it lends itself well for a simple format. Feel free to use it. We just filed off the serial numbers.
Yeah, thanks for all the research that was done on that. It really clarifies things. All right, let's move to end of year report to council.
There isn't really anything to report. I just wanted to bring it to your guys' attention that another informal report is due by the end of the year per the county code. So my question really is, how do you have any particular direction for me on putting something together, or how do you want to go about creating that report?
Well, didn't we historically, Jill, make this a pretty short summary? I mean, the robust one is the June. So I think probably, I mean, we can bring it back here, but probably Stephen and I and Barry, I mean, I'm thinking this is a couple of pages. probably.
Yeah, we've only done one of these types of reports before, and it was simply a listing for, first of all, the full task force, and then for each committee of 3 or 4 items that they've been doing, and then what's next.
Yeah, and I think it's also an opportunity for council to ask us, for council to ask Stephen and I if there's anything. I mean, it gets it on their radar, but I don't think it has to be an extremely robust. I think we just take some highlights from the minutes, a few things from our annual report, and of course, if any of the committee chairs want something added, we can do it. But it's not our. It's sort of a check-in, I think, is how I've always seen it.
So, Jill, do you have a due date when you need final guidance on that?
Well, we probably want to get started on it sooner rather than later, but it's not due until council until the end of the year, end of December. So this is October. Maybe if we could have a first draft for the November meeting, the November steering committee meeting, that would be helpful. So I think maybe committee chairs, if you can just put together a real brief list of items that you would like included, and I can put together a paragraph on each of those items. So I would say maybe that's an assignment for today, is for you committee chairs to give me a list of, say, 3 items that you've been working on and 2 or 3 items that you're going to be working on coming up in the next year in 2022.
Jill, when would it be good to have that by to you?
October 22nd.
Done.
Friday, October 22nd.
So because we haven't done this too often, I don't recall, is this something that we need the task force to approve, or is this just so informal that we compile it and submit it? Jack, do you remember?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, although I think a best practice is always to share it with the task force and see if there's any comments, but I don't think we need any formal approval. But that said, I think it would be appropriate to send it out in advance and say, hey, here's the report we've prepared. If anybody sees any thing that may perhaps needs to be corrected or edited or amended, we could certainly create a space for that, but I don't think it requires any formal approval.
So it could go out in the packet for the December meeting. Do we have a December meeting? And then could be open to discussion.
Yeah, or it could even be, if it doesn't hit the packet, it could even be an email going out, say, hey, Stephen and I are required to give an interim report. With the help of Jill, we put this together. Does anybody have any?
No, sorry, Jack, we can't do that. That would constitute an illegal meeting. Even that kind of a requesting feedback via email is considered.
Okay. Then it has to go out in the packet.
Raylene?
Thank you, Jill.
Just a quick question for Jill, if she could add that to the Legal and Justice Committee meeting, just so that we can ask if there's any specifics that the group would want us to add as chairs. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, anything else on the interim report?
Well, no, but if I want to break the law, I want to do better than an email.
You're already talking about file and serial numbers, so.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, okay. All right, we got one
I was
more.
quoting Robert Heinlein. He said that all writers, you basically file off serial numbers and you tell the same stories. So I've always liked his approach to that. He said most stories are rooted archetypally going way, way back.
All right, we got one more item. That is the future of the Crisis Stabilization Facility Committee.
Can I frame this a little bit, Barry?
Absolutely.
All right. So this committee, obviously, I think most of you know, started right when the task force started because it was our primary focus. I was the first chair, and then Chris from the hospital, and then Ann. And the real valid question came up at the last crisis stabilization facility is what role should this committee have? And we really didn't have an answer. Perry graciously has agreed to serve as a chair for the time being. And I think the issue that needs to be decided by the task force, likely with the recommendation from steering committee, is what is the value in this committee? Meaning it probably doesn't need to meet monthly. I mean, when we first started, it was arguably as much energy on this committee as anything because we were trying to get the facility built. That said, there are some realities about integrating the facility into the community, ensuring ongoing financing that may have some value in keeping this committee in place. But I would say, and Perry, feel free to weigh in. And I know Stephen, you've been there too. But I think really the issue is what do we see the role of it going forward? We don't want to just have meetings to have meetings. If we decide it should exist, is it sort of in a advisory capacity? Maybe, you know, it stays in place for another year or two as the crisis stabilization facility really finds its legs, because certainly COVID has impacted the way we envisioned it being integrated. I think there's still some improvements that can be made in law enforcement handoffs and communications and so forth. So the options really would be to continue meeting very regularly, eliminate the committee entirely, or meet on a less frequent basis and kind of figure out the scope as we go along. And I think those of us on the committee didn't have super strong, we certainly didn't have consensus, and I don't even know that any of us had super strong opinions. I think we just recognized that much of our work had changed, given that thank goodness the facility is up and running. So that would be how I would frame it. And if anybody else wants to try to frame it, go ahead.
Okay, Arlene.
Well, we just made a recommendation for ARPA funds to begin to finance a mental health urgent care facility 24/7, which is different than crisis stabilization. I know the sun is giving me special effects here.
Yeah, it sure is.
But so there's going to be a lot of work to do for another facility, which is related, but definitely not the same thing. So I guess you could either end this committee or have it be available to do the work in the planning and the organization of a 24/7 urgent care center.
Perry.
We touched base on this in our last meeting. The thought was, as Jack had mentioned, possibly moving it to quarterly, based in part on some of the items, the important items that he listed. I did want to make sure that folks knew that we do have a Crisis Stabilization Center Advisory Committee that is meeting currently. It includes the providers and law enforcement and et cetera. And there's definitely some work relative to probably most predominantly admissions via law enforcement and EMS, and also the proviso dollars that are related to the ITA admissions, that being that 12-hour admissions for law enforcement holds. So whatever is needed, I just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of those components as we were discussing it.
Okay, thanks, Perry. Mike?
I think y'all have pretty well captured it. I think from just standing at a 10,000 foot view level, since I wasn't involved directly in the committee, the way I saw it as, I guess, kind of an eventual sunset of the work of that, since it was really about getting it created. But I did think of the second piece is getting some performance data and realizing that it's not really up to full performance yet due to a number of different reasons, that keeping the committee to follow through and to see that it actually met some of the goals that I think kind of came out of this group would make sense. But a reduced meeting capacity to stretch that out would make sense. but I would certainly like to kind of have it stay so that we're keeping our own feet to the fire about, did we build what we wanted, and is it doing what we wanted? And if not, are there areas that this committee might be able to help in a different way than Perry's advisory committee could, if we need to move political will, for example, or if there are certain sticking issues. So I guess in short, I think there's still value, but I certainly agree that if it's not productive on a monthly basis, by all means reduce, but don't eliminate.
Dan?
Yeah, I think Perry answered most of my questions, and I agree with what Mike just said. I just think there's value, like Mike was saying, performance data, maybe not right now, but 6 months, a year down the road, we could, I would want to have access to that data, understand how the facility is being used or not used. I want to understand, I think, Perry, you referred to it as ITR. I've always referred to it as ITA. I don't know what the correct term is, but the involuntary treatment holds. I want to understand how that's working out with the new laws where law enforcement doesn't go, that has restrictions, basically. So I would want to have access to that data. Perry, I don't know if that advisory committee could, join us, once a year, if that would be the route to go, or should we just, as Mike was saying, just reduce it to whatever the correct amount of meetings per year. Maybe it's once a quarter. I don't know, but I do think that there's value for the time being in it.
So I got a question. Is there enough overlap between the behavioral health subcommittee and the crisis stabilization committee that those functions could be combined into one subcommittee and have that objective move over to the behavioral health committee?
Can I chime in and just answer your question real quick?
Yeah.
I think if we had the right people on the behavioral health committee, then yes, we could totally do it within that. And Perry, I can't remember, you come to those meetings, to the behavioral health, right?
Yep, I'm actually a part of that committee, and obviously, as Jack had described now, for the crisis stabilization. So I am involved in both of those, and if I can, we are gathering obviously referent data and admissions data and so forth based on referent. We have some limitations in that in regard to the fact that we don't pay for the services that the providers are doing in the crisis stabilization center, but the data sharing from them on a monthly basis is based on the lease agreement that we currently have for the building. So I'll just kind of throw that out there, that we wanted to figure out some way to continue to have a seat at the table in an ongoing way. But what changed was the ASO used to, or the dollars used to come through us, and now it comes through the ASO for crisis services. So I am on both committees. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's fine. And I apologize for not remembering. I'm on so many of these committees that they all blend together. I just forget who's on which one. But that could work. That might, consolidating might be a way to do it if people are into that idea.
And then you could you could just have an agenda item on that particular committee meeting when it's appropriate, rather than having undefined meeting times for the actual crisis stabilization committee. You could just have it be an agenda item on the behavioral health. I think also if we were to think about going down that route, we could certainly reconfigure that membership to achieve what you're talking about, Dan, to make sure that the right people are on that. Raylene?
Yeah, I like that idea, Barry. I'm just wondering if we could just put that to the quarterly behavioral health joint meeting with Law and Justice Committee, because it does impact the officers that want to be able to drop somebody off at that crisis stabilization unit. And so I'm wondering if that quarterly meeting would be a better place for this.
Jack?
I think these are good ideas. It may make sense to integrate. I also thought it was interesting, if you think of the crisis stabilization facility committee as almost a facilities committee, to go back to Arlene's comment. My recommendation for oh, I don't know, through June of 2022 would be to just have crisis stabilization meet quarterly, and then figure out where we want to go. We could disband it now. I don't necessarily see the value in that, but I also don't see the value in meeting monthly. So, and I do think we need to make some kind of a decision, because it doesn't make sense to meet monthly to me, and it doesn't make sense to disband it entirely and move it into something else quite yet. But I think that definitely makes some sense, and I like the idea of with the law and justice and if you had all of that quarterly meeting, the stakeholders are all present. So, but my short-term thing for Perry would be to say, let's schedule quarterly meetings for at least two, and then go from there. And probably in the spring, we can figure out for sure what we want to do with this. And I actually do want to explore the idea. I like your idea, Arlene. I think you were saying almost a facilities committee, like a subcommittee that handles these facilities that are trying to or supports and integrates facilities back to the task force that help with our mission to reduce incarceration, help with mental health. I think that is worth looking at a little bit too.
Well, an urgent care center is going to cover all the missing parts of what this crisis stabilization does not cover, which was one of the original problems with the system, was that the requirements for treatment there were so stringent originally that a lot of people wouldn't qualify to come there. But in an urgent care center, there is not stringent requirements for treatment and dealing with people. It would be really broad.
So Jack, when I was thinking about this, as far as consolidating committees, I was thinking along the same lines that you're thinking, not right away, but just trying to throw some ideas up that we can talk about. But
I think an eye to that makes sense. I think we either consolidate or we expand the scope. It's kind of one or the other.
Yeah, it's worthy of our discussion over the next few months, I think. Stephen?
Three quick responses. Number one, I like Jack's idea, to go to quarterly meetings for some period of time. I think that's at the discretion of the committee and Perry in particular. I don't think we need to approve that particularly. I like the idea of consolidating. I think the idea of a facilities committee that incorporates the urgent care planning is the better way to go, because I think what we want is an unbroken continuum of services. So planning that urgent care to come right up to the border, or at least define the gray area between that and the crisis stabilization, is useful, so we don't have two different things with a gap in the middle like we have in much of our service continuum is ideal. And I'd like to voice some serious consternation about adding that to the plate of the Behavioral Health Committee, or even more to the quarterly joint committee meetings. I understand the overlaps there, but Dan and Mike have done a really good job adding a piece to the Behavioral Health Committee on the prevention end. They're going way upstream. And I think the scope that you'd be building from early childhood, family stability kinds of stuff, school-based services, ARTs, I mean, there's just too much there. They have packed agendas already in the meetings, and to expand the membership and the scope of behavioral health, I think is unwise. I think the quarterly Behavioral Health and Legal and Justice Committee meetings barely make it through their agenda, also because there's so much overlap. So I just don't think that's a good place to look for consolidation.
Caleb?
Sorry, I just have to jump off to another meeting. I didn't want to be rude and just leave, so I apologize. I do have to go. I appreciate all you guys' help today, and I look forward to meeting again.
Okay. Yeah, I have to do the same thing in about 5 minutes. So, Dan?
I just was listening to Stephen's remarks, and I don't know, like, like the business person side of me loves consolidation. If you can get more stuff done and, pack it in and do it, that works. But, I think you're right, Stephen, to some degree, that the quality of the discussions that we have is really high. The scope of what we do, Chris Cochran from the schools is there talking about like adolescent, mental health stuff that then can lead into criminogenic behavior or criminal justice system involvement. I don't know. I mean, I guess I want to stay updated on crisis stabilization. I really want to understand the center and understand how it works. So that's really the outcome that I'm looking for. So, I'm not attached to the how part of it necessarily, as long as we can get the briefing or the updates. And, like I said before, without the changing laws, and I just want to understand this more fully. And I think, in a year, what does it look like? So I think we just really need to consider that, be thoughtful as to what this is going to look like as we go through these processes. So Stephen, I hear you. I'm going to amend my earlier comments. It's funny how that happens sometimes in meetings, right? You get the different perspective. So I appreciate it. I just want to, I'm not going to make a decision today. I just think it's too premature.
Well, I think that's
Dan, you can come to another committee meeting now.
Dan, you're open-minded,
Yeah, that's right.
valuable. Yeah.
so. Yeah, this is what spitballing's all about. This is, Perry.
Yeah, I really agree with some of the pieces. I would personally be a lot more comfortable, since I'm sort of in it, sort of up to my eyebrows at this point in terms of the advisory committee and some of the work that's being done. And it makes perfect sense what Councilmember Hamill is saying in regard to, wanting some data, some information of, what's coming out of that. And I'm more than willing to commit to that until, this maybe gets handed off to the new HS manager. But I like the idea of it going quarterly for a period of time. It's not imminent in terms of making a decision. The facility's open. We are nearly at capacity most times. And so, there's a lot of good things to report, but that would be my preference if we're counting.
Jill?
I'm hearing pretty much consensus, tell me if I'm wrong, of scheduling the Crisis Stabilization Committee quarterly for 2022. I'm working out the 2022 agenda for all the committees. So I would like to go ahead and put up an annual schedule for that committee as well, for open public meetings purposes, and we can always cancel meetings if we need to. Let me know if you have something else in mind.
Sounds good. Dan?
I'm wondering if this is totally selfish, but I will include the Legal and Justice Committee in my thinking here. But could the Crisis Stabilization Center Committee on that quarterly meet prior to the other committees' meetings? So then we could get a fresh briefing. If it were just like a week before, then behavioral health would meet a week after, and whenever Legal and Justice meets, I don't know. I would want to have fresh data, basically.
We can work with the committee on that, sure.
Okay, one more question, then we'll do public comment and we'll adjourn. So, Raylene?
Thank you. I'll keep it real quick. I agreed with Stephen on we want to make sure the value of the content is good. I would guess that I would want to just make sure on our Legal and Justice Committee that we quarterly on our meeting that we have questions from law enforcement or additions or anybody in our committee that want to just make sure that the questions that they have or are addressed with the crisis stabilization, either before their meeting or after their meeting, we can discuss, this is what's happening. What do you guys want to see? What are the needs that you have, so that we can bring that to them for their next meeting?
Okay. All right, Jill, is there anybody in the participant world that wants to do public comment?
We have no attendees at this time. And if Jack and Steve could stay behind, that would be helpful. Thank you.
All right, folks, thanks for the spirited meetings. It was great. We shall see you again at the task force meeting. We're adjourned.